Hello, I'm Richard Murphy, and this is the third in a series of videos that I'm making on tax havens and how we should look at them in 2021 when these videos are being made. In the first video, I looked at what tax havens are and explained that the common identifying feature of them is the fact that they supply secrecy to their users, and I explained how that worked. In the second video, I looked at how people use that secrecy basically to cheat. But let me move to the subject of this video, which is how do tax havens undermine regulation of other places? This was a question I had to ask way back in 2008, 2009, when I was involved in setting up the first ever Tax Justice Network Financial Secrecy Index and was defining what a secrecy jurisdiction was, because that's the whole basis of that project, which still goes on, but with which, by the way, I now have no involvement. But I also needed to look at how the regulation of the world was abused from tax havens. And to do that, I came up with the concept of, well, there being four locations where regulation can take place. And they are, to summarize in advance, here, somewhere, elsewhere, and nowhere. Let's work through what they mean. Here is a simple idea. Here is the place where a person is. So, if there's a person who trades in the UK, has all their income arise in the UK, has all their companies located in the UK, and makes all their tax returns and company account declarations to UK authorities, then everything they do is regulated here. Now, let's suppose that person now does something a little rash. They go and buy themselves a holiday home in France. I wouldn't recommend it, but people do. I think the best day of owning a holiday home, as I've always been told by a client, is the day you buy it and the day you sell it. But if they were to go and buy that holiday home in France and they let it, again, as a lot of people do, they've undertaken a completely legitimate, entirely reasonable business transaction, but it is regulated somewhere else. Because the French tax authorities, the local French mayor, and others will need to know about what is going on with regard to the ownership of this holiday property and the declaration of the income arising from it, before that income also has to be declared here. Now, somewhere means that here can identify which other place has a first claim on regulation of that transaction before any of its consequences in the place where a person might actually live are then also considered. Somewhere, critically, is identifiable and disclosed. Somewhere has a proper and legitimate claim and, what is more, exercises its responsibilities with regard to that claim. It is another location that is as diligent in its task of making sure that a transaction is regulated as the place where the person actually lives. Let's move on to the next category, and that is elsewhere. Elsewhere is the term that I use to describe a tax haven. A tax haven may well not disclose that it is regulating a transaction, of course, on the basis of the secrecy which is still commonplace in tax havens and which still does, in very many cases, obscure the true ownership of tax haven transactions, then that non-disclosure of regulation is deliberate. And of course, there's also the fact that in a tax haven, there is very deliberate light touch regulation. There may be no requirement for a company to file accounts with anyone. There may be no requirement to submit a corporation tax return because there is no corporation tax system in a tax haven. There may be no requirement for the trustees of a trust to provide any sort of information on the activities of the trust or who benefits from it to tax authorities. So there is not only no regulation that is effective, but there is no effective disclosure of that information as a consequence to the place which might be interested in the transaction taking place there, which is the place here where the person benefiting from those transactions is actually located. In other words, here has little idea where elsewhere in the world that transaction is regulated and has limited chance of securing that information unless there are measures put in place to enforce that place elsewhere to provide information to it. So elsewhere is the place where transactions are hidden, if at all possible. And that describes most tax havens. There is, however, one final category that I mentioned, and that is nowhere. This is the ultimate goal of the tax haven abuser. And nowhere is possible. Nowhere means that a transaction exists, well, if you like, in the ether. Nobody has any responsibility at all to ever regulate it. And let me give you a simple example of what such a transaction might be. A person who lives in the UK but is not domiciled here, in other words, for tax purposes, they have satisfied the UK tax authorities that this is not their long-term home, and they are willing to pay a fee to buy this status because that is basically what you now have to do to secure this advantage in the long term. They, once they have paid that fee, do not have to disclose any of their income or gains or profits or company or trust activities outside the UK to the UK tax authority, who you might think is here in terms of regulation of their activities, but which it has chosen not to be. As a consequence, they can place transactions in tax havens elsewhere, but elsewhere has literally nowhere to report them to, even if they're required to, because they aren't here in the UK for regulatory purposes. And therefore, the net consequence is that because the tax haven chooses not to regulate these transactions, because that's what those places do, and the UK does not choose to regulate those transactions because that's what it's chosen to do, they are nowhere. It is actually possible to have unregulated financial transactions in the world still, with no tax paid, of course, as well. Now, those are the four categories. And understanding that gives an insight into how we can tackle the abuse. Because, effectively, here is not a problem so long as the administrative authorities undertake their jobs properly. A big issue in many countries, including the UK, where I have to say that on occasions I don't think they do, but presuming they do, here is not a problem. Nor is somewhere a problem, so long as, again, the administrative authorities do their job properly and cooperate, as is normal between well-functioning tax and regulatory authorities. Elsewhere is a problem because there isn't voluntary disclosure. That is why, and I will explain this in a later video, there have been campaigns to put into place what are called automatic information exchange systems between tax havens and the countries where a person is, here, in other words. But nowhere is a very special case, and it's only facilitated by a few countries in the world, the UK being one of them. And it is a place, it is a system where people are allowed to escape from regulation altogether. We do it. Switzerland does it. I think there are other places that I can name which do it. But the point is, they are allowing the world's wealthiest to get out of regulation altogether. That's totally unacceptable. But it targets, in that case, attention upon the system of exempting people in places where they really are, in other words, here, from any obligation to literally comply with the law. Understanding this has helped us to tackle tax havens, and that's why this quite complex issue is one that I think it was worth producing this video about. I hope you followed it. There's a link underneath to the paper in which I explored this idea, which also lays out a whole series of diagrams to explain how it works and how this idea of nowhere and what I call the secrecy space in which those transactions takes place occur. Anyway, have a look at that, but understand that we have to know how regulation takes place and how cooperation between regulatory authorities takes place to ensure that we can beat the abuse that tax havens have always existed to promote. Thanks for watching. If you're interested in what I've been saying in this video, please subscribe. There is a button below the viewing screen. If you're interested in what I have to say on Twitter, I'm at Richard J. Murphy on that medium. If you want to look at my blog, that's taxresearch.org.uk. And we have a Facebook page as well, Richard J. Murphy. So one of those things will get you more information on what this video series is about, and I hope I'll see you again soon.